they're good technical people. So something had to be done. So I decided, what the hell did I know? We're going to discontinue the Porsche 911, and I was an airplane pilot. And I had flown the Atlantic a couple of times in the right seat of a Boeing with the guy who was then running the racing stuff at Volkswagen, pardon me, at Daimler-Benz. And he had to retire because he turned 30, imagine that.
Yeah,
and he could no longer fly the Atlantic after the age of 30. So I decided that they were going to start a new company called Airbus. And they were going to copy Boeing. And I was a pilot at that time. And so I decided I really need the business. I got to have something to keep the engineers busy. Otherwise, they'd all take off and leave because we couldn't pay them anymore. So I went to Toulouse. And the guy who was running the engineering part of Airbus had been a Lufthansa pilot, and I had flown the Atlantic with him twice in the right seat while he was a pilot in command. So I went there and I asked him, you're going to build an airliner. What would you think of getting rid of the third person in the cockpit of a commercial airliner and build a modern instrument operation? Well, you see, what had happened at that time, the Navy had built an airplane called an A4 and had two people, a pilot and a flight engineer, was about this wide, and they had no room to put all the instruments that you need to fly that kind of an airplane. Remember, the Boeing 707 had a pilot, a co-pilot, and then a flight engineer that sat at right angles behind the co-pilot, and he had an instrument panel from the floor to the ceiling and the whole length of that front cockpit with nothing but gauges, you know, to operate the jet airliner. So I went to Toulouse and caught up with my old friend who was now running the Airbus thing. And I asked him if he would be interested in designing a glass cockpit for his new airplane. Well, he had heard of a glass cockpit, but he had flown Boeings and had never any experience. But about 20 people on his staff had flown A4s for the U.S. Navy and the Navy in Germany. And so they knew what a glass cockpit was. It had two oscilloscopes and then a small row of instruments, and it had a position switch. And when you got in that airline, and then A4, when you got in, you flipped the button that said start, and you got all the instruments you needed to start the engine on these two TV oscilloscopes. And the guy in the back seat had the same thing. Well, after you got the engine started, you'd push the next button for taxi. And now you had a GPS of the airport and all the taxiways and all the instruments you needed to warm the engines up as you taxied. And then the next one was take off and climb and cruise, and you got a whole different cockpit each time, you see. So I went to Toulouse and I asked them whether they would be interested in building that kind of a cockpit for their new airliner, and you could get rid of the third person in the cockpit, you know, and pilots were in demand at the time, so that was a pretty big deal.
Right.
Anyway, I got a contract, went back to Stuttgart, and I had a couple of guys who had been in the military and who knew exactly what it is I was trying to do. I didn't. Hell, I'd never even sat in an airplane with that kind of thing. So we got the contract and we built the front end of an A300 Airbus. It ended at the passenger entrance right behind where the pilot sat. The inside of the cockpit was all flat black, nothing in there, except that I had flown the Atlantic a number of times in the right seat of a 707. And I'm telling you, after about 5 hours in that seat, you could hardly get up and walk to the can. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, incredibly uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Well, I got 2 Recaro seats out of a Porsche 911. I put one where the pilot sat and one for the co-pilot. But when you were in this mock-up and you looked into the cockpit, all you saw was black. You couldn't see the seats, you see. Well, I got a bunch of captains from Lufthansa, Alitalia, and Air France. I got the Germans first so that we could talk German. And they climbed in this thing and they looked, and everything is black and blank in the cockpit. And I told them, your job is going to be to come here and tell us exactly where you want all the instruments, you see. Well, then they walked in and they saw those Recaro seats. I'm telling you, the first guy who sat down in those seats, the reaction was, oh my God, what is this? I said, well, that's a Recaro seat out of a Porsche. Wow, he says, can we have those in this new cockpit?
That's all they're worried about.
I mean, that got their attention. I mean, right now.
Yeah,
And I said, sure. Well, then all these pilots in turn came, and they had to sit in those seats and tell us where to put all the instruments and blah, blah, blah. So they really designed the cockpit.
I love that story.
Wow.
What about the 911 with Helmet? What was the gentleman's name that worked for you and the 911 was going to end?
Oh, yeah, I forget his name.
But the gentleman that, yes.
Well, you see, I had learned to do that when I was in charge of diesel engines for Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana. And I have always taken the approach, you gotta understand the person who's going to use the damn thing before you start designing something. You know, I mean, unless you really knew all, and I never did. Well, what we did is I rode around for 3 months in the over-the-road trucks. It's all in the book. And what I found out is those trucks were really uncomfortable. I mean, the engine was right between the 2 seats. You sat right on top of that damn thing, and the smell and the heat, and there was no air conditioning, no electric windows, no radio, hell, you couldn't hear it anyway, and none of that, you see. For 3 months, I rode around the country in those goddamn trucks, sitting in the right seat, through the heat of the summer, the cold of the winter, over the mountains, through the valleys, you know, 120 degrees, before I started to design the engine. And I really just took an old engine and turbocharged it and all that. But I went to Kenworth and told them what I had done. And I said, I want your fanciest truck just to borrow. And they gave me one, conventional, with the engine where it belongs, you know, out in front, and all the doodahs and electric windows and air conditioning and the hi-fi radios and all that. And I took that out and let the union drivers have a chance to drive it. And of course they went bananas. And then we led the revolution that today has resulted in what you see on the road. You don't see anybody sitting on top of the engine anymore, except for a garbage truck or something, that has to be real small. But we went to work and we did that. And I just did it all over again with Airbus.
And Porsche as well, right? Because when you showed up at Porsche, they had the model years that were going to end.
The only thing that was going to be left was the 924 and the 928. And the 911 was finished, you see. And so now I had to figure out what to do, because I knew there were thousands of them all over the world. And they were never going to die, because people kept updating them and racing them and modifying them and all that. So I said, well, we can't discontinue this. But on the other hand, I can't continue to supply parts and engines and all that kind of stuff, because there weren't enough there to warrant that kind of an operation. So that's when I decided to take the 911 and make an airplane engine out of it. You know, it was air-cooled, or, you know, it was perfect configuration for it. And so I went and found out that in order to have an airplane engine, every supplier had to be certified, blah, 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 and the FAA, this and that, and all that stuff. And I decided, well, I got two choices. I can either allow the 911 that's already in existence to die off by not supplying spares, or I can make an airplane engine out of the Porsche 911, air-cooled engine. And so they started investigating. That was not easy to do, because in order to be certified to build airplane engines, you had to track every part that went into it, where it came from, was it certified, blah, blah, blah. And I figured, what the hell? That doesn't sound like a bad idea to just build a car engine to those standards. So that's what we did.
And that started it all.
Pardon?
That started it all.
We ended up building 50 engines for airplanes, and I was the chief test pilot. I even had one that turbocharged, but we never built the control system for it, so you had to twiddle valves to keep the boost and everything. But I'm telling you, that movie with that engine in it, it was incredible.
You told me one time about there was in an engineer's office, they had the years the cars were going to stop.
That was Helmut Bott,
and
chief engineer.
And you took a chalk or something?
But you see, what had happened, I got letters from all over the world. People crying, why are you discontinuing? I said, what the hell, I'm not discontinuing anything. I just got hired, you know. And I'm doing whatever I can to save the engine.
Right.
One way was to make an airplane engine out of it. Well, it turns out that I got so many calls from all over the world, and went out to see Helmut Bott, who was an incredible chief engineer. I mean, Helmut Bott was not only very, very smart technically, but he knew how to train young engineers and how to get them excited about what we were doing. And the same thing with customers. I mean, people who loved 911s, I took them out there, introduced them to Helmut Bott, and I mean, they would leave with stars in their eyes, you know. And he was such a decent guy, up front, you know, and he ended up being one of my best friends that I've ever had. But anyway, I was in his office, and on the wall, he had, this is all in the book, incidentally, on the wall was a big chart, 924, 928, and years going on about 20 years to the end of the chart. and lines indicating the amount of continuing investment in both of those cars. At the bottom of the chart was the 911. And it ended at the end of that first year that I had been hired, you know, just so. So what he's talking about, I was talking to Helmut Bott, and I had heard from all over the world about all these people who were crying that the 911 was going to be discontinued, and what in the hell are you people thinking about? So I had already made my decision, and I went out to see Helmut Bott, and I saw that chart on the wall, and it ended about 3 feet from the end of the room at both ends. And on his table, he had a big black marker pen. I picked that pen up, walked over to the chart on his wall, and I extended the 911 all the way to the end of the chart, continued it on the wall of his office to the corner, around the corner, behind his desk, and over to the window behind his desk. And I said, Mr. Bott, do we understand each other? And he had a grin on his face.
Oh, wow. They're great.
And that is how the 911 was saved.
I love that story, Peter.
That is unbelievable. I wouldn't have no idea.
And we never looked back.
Well, it's a good thing.
I mean, except I had already started with this airplane project, you see. So I decided, you know what the hell? If we're going to continue this engine indefinitely, why don't we just go ahead and make everything to aircraft standards? We now have the contacts, you know, and the FAA kept telling me that, you know, if you don't want to cut a couple of corners, we'll go along with it, because that's what all the other people who were building those air-cooled airplane engines were doing. And I told them that is out of the question. Porsche has never done that, and we're not going to start now. I says, I want to comply with every regulation you have in spades. Well, that made them my best friends. Sure. You see, so they would come over to Germany, and they would tell us how to do this and how to do that, so that it could be fully qualified. And that's how the 911 was saved. Since then, to the best of my knowledge, every engine that certainly as long as I was there and as long as Vita King was, I don't know what's happened since then. But to the best of my knowledge, every engine in every Porsche, including the ones that are really not true Porsches, you know, like the one my wife drives, that wonderful four-door sedan, and the Audi station wagon thing, what the hell is it called? The Panamera. All of that, to the best of my knowledge, is still built to those standards. And there's not another car in the world that has ever attempted that. Because it's serious. I mean, if you want to be qualified for aircraft quality, you got to do it.
And you convinced Porsche to start racing again. You were integral in racing.
Well, I asked Professor Porsche one day, and this is all in the book. I asked Professor Porsche one day, I said, Professor, give me a hand here. Where do you think I should start? And he said, go to a race. So I went to, in the U.S., the 12-hour race. Sebring. I went over to Sebring, and I met the guy that got killed in his airplane, the driver. I'm terrible with names. There've just been too many.
Right.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's overload.
Right.
But anyway, I went, and for the first time, I saw a Porsche. What's that big old noisy one? The one that makes all the racket.
The 917?
Yeah. No, after that. It's in the book. You'll recognize it.
Right.
So I went out to Sebring, and Al Holbert was the driver. And the son of a bitch had this engine behind, in the back of the car, and big old exhaust pipes, turbochargers, and I mean that thing made a racket you could not believe. And Al Holbert drove that thing in Sebring, and he won that race. And I flew back to Germany, and I didn't think I needed an airplane. I mean, I felt like because I had seen that, and I said, baby, that's the answer, to what's got to be done. Got back to Germany and had a meeting in Weissach, and I said, everybody that has anything to do with racing in the cafeteria at 9 o'clock. And I had half the world there, including some people that didn't even work for Porsche. I mean, they were suppliers from Bielstein and who the hell knows what, who happened to be there that day, and they all came to this thing. The room was completely full. And I told them what I had just experienced in Sebring. And they thought I was kind of a nutcase because for them, this car was really obsolete, and Al Holbert and his guys in Pennsylvania were racing them, but they were really no longer an active race car for Porsche AG. And I asked him, I said, if we wanted to win Le Mans next year, where would we have to start? Well, they said, we have 2 cars in the museum, and they won the races like that in their time, but they're now obsolete. And I said, well, what would it take to get one of those and fix it up and win Le Mans next year? They said, well, yeah, I guess we could do that. And I said, the meeting's adjourned. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I mean, I never did much talking because I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. I didn't want to make a damn fool out of myself, So if they had an answer, I said, I'll be back here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I would like to hear your plan. Well, they came back and they said, we got 2 of them, and this and that, and we'd have to, I had no idea what in the hell they were talking about, And I said, well, let's meet again this time next week. Meeting's adjourned. And that was the beginning of this big turnaround. The end of that story was they took that old Porsche and completely rebuilt it, did a few things that hadn't been done before with the brakes and who the hell knows what. And not only did we go to Le Mans that year, that was 1980, 81, but we won. And for the first time in the history of that race, for the 24 hours, nobody ever touched anything on that car that stopped working. All they did was brake linings, brake shoes, and that kind of stuff. And we finished that race and we won it. But what I had done, without really asking anybody, is I brought the whole Porsche and Piëch families for the first time that Professor Porsche had been in where the hell was it, the name of the race?
Le Mans.
Yeah,
Le Mans.
Le Mans. The first time Professor Porsche had been there for I don't know what decades, And I had everybody there, Ferdinand, Piëch, and blah, 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 and the kids and the wives and all that. And I also took a whole bunch of employees. I went to the union and I said, if you guys want to go to Le Mans this year, you've got an invitation and I'll pay for the transportation. You go rent some buses and all that. And so we were there with everybody. It was the last year that at Le Mans, the cars were not built up at the track. But Porsche had always built the cars for the Le Mans race in a little church in the middle of a little town where they had it fixed up, you know, to take all the cars apart and put them back together. And so I would go there, spend the whole day with them when they reworked all this stuff, you know. And then we had a huge party the day before the race. And back in those days, they drove the cars to the track, which was about 14 kilometers, you know, right down the city streets and everything. So it was really kind of primitive, and yet it had a charm to it. And at Le Mans, back in those days, there was a straight, 3.some kilometers,
Yeah, the Mulsanne Straight.
The Mulsanne Straight. And of course, I got a ride in a helicopter to check it all out, and then they took me around in a Porsche car, I forget what the hell it was. But the Mulsanne is a straight run, about 3-some kilometers. At the end of it was a right angle turn back in those days. That was the
Still is.
intersection of two country roads. And about 3/4 of the way down the Le Mans Straight was a little restaurant right at the edge of the track. And when the race was run, they built a steel guardrail, and you could sit in that restaurant with your elbow on the guardrail. And the cars would be coming by there, I mean, just everything. You could begin to hear something in the distance. And at night, you could see the headlights bouncing and reflecting on the trees. And Sheila and I would sit and have tea at midnight or 1 a.m. with hands on the guard, you know, elbow on the guardrail, and these cars that come roaring by there. I mean, just making an incredible noise. The Porsches, of course, were turbocharged. There was a lot of whistling and that kind of stuff. But boy, when the Ferraris came by with their 12-cylinder engines and the BMWs with a straight 6, you know, that noise was just heavenly. The Porsches were quiet by comparison. And then after we had something to eat at about 1:30 in the morning, Sheila and I would go down to the end of the Mulsanne Straight. Now this is all in the book. And you could, then it was the intersection of 2 country roads. And the cars would come from 3 kilometers away. And you could hear this dull roar. And then the next thing you would see is the headlights as the cars bounced, you know, reflecting off the trees that would overhang the track. And it would get louder and louder and louder, and then pretty soon, all of a sudden, bam, you could see the headlights reflected in the trees. And then when they were, I don't know, not very far from the corner at the end of the Mulsanne, you could hear them cut the engine, and then, you know, blah, 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 all that kind of, especially the Ferraris and the BMWs with open exhaust, you know, they made the most fantastic noise. And they'd come right down to the end, and it was a right angle intersection of 2 roads. And they would just go blah, 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 and turn that corner. And then the Porsches had the 2 turbochargers on the back, you know, and when they turned that corner and got on the gas, it made an incredible racket. I mean, we were like from here to that white car, you know, from the tail end after they turned. And then you could see the exhaust stacks start lighting up, and the turbochargers would get bright red, you know, and the roar was just incredible as they accelerated away. And then the Ferraris with their 12-cylinder engines and the open exhausts, and the BMW with the straight sixes, you know, and they had no mufflers at all. I mean, it was just fantastic. And we could sit there for a couple of hours watching them go by, you know. And I wrote all that up in the book because I got to tell you that was just magic.
And Porsche Racing never looked back after that. You got it back into racing, and it.
That one car.
Was that the 962 that won Le Mans in 1980?
I don't
Turbos?
remember all the
Yeah.
numbers.
I remember following it
It
back
was
then,
the
but
only race it ran because at the end, after that race, they changed all the rules.
yeah,
And you had to go to a monocoque construction, and that was
Right.
the beginning of the
right.
next generation.
Yeah, I remember I think it was the 962, but I'm not. I have to look it up.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, you can look in the book.
Yeah.
I'm certainly sold on getting the book.
Yeah.
Boy, you want a book?
I'd love one.
Well,